The evolution of gaming, 1970s to 2025, history you didn't know. In a world before pixels had color and before controllers fit in the palm of a hand, there was only the hum of circuitry and the spark of imagination that refused to stay silent. Because somewhere in the early 1970s, a few dreamers stared at a blank oscilloscope screen and wondered, what if this machine could play? That single thought would ignite a revolution that would outgrow living rooms, define childhoods, and eventually rewrite the very idea of what it means to play. The story of gaming begins not with billion-dollar studios or streaming platforms, but with a tiny white blip bouncing across a black background, Pong. In 1972, when Atari launched its simple table tennis simulation, no one knew that a quarter dropped into a wooden cabinet in a smoky bar would echo through the decades. The game's beeps and bounces were primitive, yet behind each pixel lived a promised proof that humans could talk to machines in the language of fun. Soon the fever spread. Arcades began glowing like neon temples of the future. Teenagers lined up with pockets full of quarters, chasing scores that flashed in red LEDs, battling invisible enemies that existed only in electrons. It was a cultural heartbeat. Space Invaders in '78, Asteroids in '79, Pac-Man in 1980, devouring dots and loneliness alike. For the first time, entertainment wasn't passive. You didn't just watch a story, you controlled it. And yet behind the blinking lights, a quiet war brewed in basements and garages, where hobbyists soldered circuits and wrote code that no one would ever see, determined to shrink the arcade into something that could live at home. When Atari released the 2600 console, the dream shifted from the arcade to the living room, where families gathered around bulky televisions, joysticks in hand, discovering that competition could live under the same roof as cooperation. Children learned hand-eye coordination before they learned to write. Parents discovered the strange joy of losing to their own kids. The smell of plastic cartridges, the static pop when you switched the TV to Channel 3, these became the sounds of a new generation. As the 80s rolled in, Japan joined the race with precision and imagination. Nintendo entered the scene, first with the Famicom and then with the NES, giving birth to icons who would outlive their creators. Mario, Donkey Kong, Link, Samus. These weren't just sprites. They were heroes who climbed from our screens into our dreams. In dim bedrooms across America, children pressed buttons that transported them to kingdoms built from code. And somewhere between the pipes and castles of Super Mario Bros., a universal truth emerged. Gaming wasn't just a pastime, it was storytelling in motion. Meanwhile, technology marched forward like an 8-bit drumbeat. Sega fought Nintendo in a rivalry that turned store shelves into battlegrounds. Sonic's blue blur raced against Mario's cheerful jump. And every playground argument about who was faster or stronger was really an early sign that gaming had become identity. Arcades began to fade as home consoles grew powerful enough to capture their magic. Yet their spirit lived on in the glow of CRTs and the clatter of button mashing. By the end of the decade, the pixels grew smaller, colors brighter, sounds richer, and the limits of imagination seemed to dissolve. But even as players marveled at side-scrolling adventures and 8-bit soundtracks that could make you feel joy or fear, a quiet revolution brewed again in laboratories and startup offices. Developers were dreaming of the third dimension, of worlds that weren't flat but deep, where you could walk around a mountain instead of jumping over it. The 1970s and 1980s had given birth to the medium. Now, as the curtain prepared to rise on the 1990s, gaming was about to take its first real step into infinity. The 1990s arrived like a thunderclap, shattering the limits of what gaming could be, and as technology roared forward, the flat worlds of the 80s began to stretch and breathe, pixels twisting into shapes that hinted at depth, motion, and life. In the living rooms of America, the hum of 16-bit consoles became the new lullaby, and a generation learned to dream in cartridges and save files. The console wars erupted, Nintendo's Super NES battling Sega's Genesis in an arms race of colors, sound chips, and attitude. Advertising became warfare. Sonic's speed challenged Mario's heart, and kids divided themselves into camps, clutching controllers like banners of loyalty. Behind the rivalry lay an extraordinary truth. Gaming was growing up. Storylines deepened, music soared with digital orchestras, and game worlds became places of belonging. Titles like The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, and Final Fantasy VI whispered that games could be emotional, not just mechanical, that pixels could make players cry. Then came 1994, when a Japanese electronics giant took a gamble that would forever change the landscape. Sony entered the arena with its sleek gray box, the PlayStation, and suddenly gaming wasn't just for kids. CDs replaced cartridges, soundtracks became symphonies, and developers unleashed their creativity without the constraints of memory chips. For the first time, games began to look cinematic. Players watched full-motion cutscenes, heard voice acting, and felt goosebumps as orchestral scores merged with digital adventures. Final Fantasy VII took hearts hostage. Resident Evil terrified a generation, and Metal Gear Solid blurred the line between movie and game. Meanwhile, in 1996, Nintendo answered back with the Nintendo 64, launching Super Mario 64 World, a game that didn't just define 3D, it invented it. Players no longer pushed characters across screens, they inhabited them. You could run, climb, swim, and fall through open worlds that felt infinite compared to the flat stages of the past. Kids who grew up blowing dust out of cartridges now found themselves exploring 3D castles, their imaginations sprinting as fast as their digital avatars. But it wasn't just consoles changing. PCs were quietly plotting a takeover of their own. In dimly lit bedrooms, players linked computers through dial-up connections, the shriek of modems announcing a new kind of competition, online gaming. Or, Doom and Quake brought multiplayer deathmatches into homes, turning friends into enemies and basements into battlegrounds. LAN parties became teenage rites of passage, fueled by pizza, energy drinks, and the thrill of fragging your best friend at 3 a.m. The mouse and keyboard became new weapons, precision tools in the hands of digital gladiators. As the millennium loomed, a quiet prophecy took shape. Someday, everyone would be connected and gaming would become the new social language. The late 90s cemented gaming as mainstream culture. Pokemon conquered Game Boys and playgrounds alike, blurring lines between the virtual and real. The Sims let players play God, building lives pixel by pixel, while Tony Hawk's Pro Skater turned controllers into skateboards and soundtracks into cultural anthems. By 2001, the torch passed again. A green ring glowed in the dark, and a new contender stepped into the fight, Microsoft's Xbox. Backed by corporate power and armed with hard drives and Ethernet ports, it brought Halo. Combat evolved, a game that would define modern shooters and give the world its first taste of true console multiplayer. When Master Chief stepped onto that alien ring world, players felt the birth of an icon. At the same time, Sony unveiled the PlayStation 2, a console so dominant it would sell over 150 million units, making it not just a gaming device, but a generational artifact. It was the DVD player that justified its own purchase, the gateway to cinematic gaming. Meanwhile, Nintendo, ever the innovator, released the GameCube, colorful and compact, a machine built not to win wars, but to remind players that fun mattered more than specs. By the mid-2000s, gaming was evolving faster than technology itself. Developers chased realism with engines that rendered sweat, shadows, and emotion. Franchises like Grand Theft Auto, God of War, and Call of Duty pushed boundaries of violence, storytelling, and spectacle. Online play became a way of life, with Xbox Live connecting millions across continents. For the first time, gaming wasn't something you did alone. It was a global conversation conducted through headsets and lag. Yet even as graphics reached stunning fidelity, something deeper was changing beneath the surface. The culture around gaming. Esports tournaments began filling arenas, fans cheering not for athletes on a field, but for players on a stage. The word gamer no longer meant a kid in a dark room. It meant a community, a movement, a new kind of athlete. By the late 2000s, mobile devices and social media were sneaking into the picture, laying the groundwork for an explosion that would redefine accessibility. The joystick had evolved into a touchscreen, and soon, everyone, mothers, commuters, children, would become gamers without even realizing it. The 1990s and 2000s were more than technological leaps. They were emotional ones, carrying the industry from pixels to people, from cartridges to connectivity, from isolation to immersion. And as the decade turned once more, one thing became undeniable. Gaming was no longer a niche. It was the new mainstream. The 2010s erupted like a supernova of innovation, where every fragment of the past fused into something far grander, faster, and more connected than anyone could have dreamed. Gaming no longer belonged only to consoles or arcades. It had slipped into every pocket, every phone, every spare moment of life. The decade began with two forces colliding: nostalgia and progress, and somewhere in between, a new kind of player was born: the global gamer. Broadband internet had matured, consoles were always online, and the word iMultiplayer had evolved from an option on a menu to the very essence of gaming itself. Titles like Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, Tu Asteroids, and Battlefield 3 weren't just games, they were digital battlefields where millions met nightly, voices echoing through headsets across continents. Competition turned into community, and the living room became the world's largest arena. Meanwhile, indie developers rose like digital artisans, crafting experiences that reminded everyone what creativity felt like in an age of blockbusters. Minecraft arrived like a quiet revolution in 2011, a game built on simple cubes that let players build entire universes. It was proof that imagination still ruled, that graphics meant nothing without heart. In that same year, another phenomenon took flight: Skyrim, a game so vast and alive it felt like a parallel reality. Players didn't just complete missions, they lived lives within its snow-covered peaks. Open worlds became the new standard, and freedom became the new narrative. But something even bigger was brewing. something that would change not just how games were played, but how they were seen. Platforms like Twitch and YouTube Gaming transformed players into performers, turning private victories into global spectacles. Streamers became celebrities, speedrunners became legends, and commentary became entertainment in its own right. The age of passive viewership returned, but this time the audience could talk back. Livestream chat scrolled like digital applause, and gamers who once played in solitude now built communities of millions. Suddenly, being good at a game wasn't the only path to fame. Being yourself while playing became a career. Meanwhile, new hardware reshaped how we touched games. Motion sensors, VR headsets, and mobile gyroscopes blurred the boundary between physical and digital. Nintendo once again dared to be different with the Wii, making grandmothers bowl and toddlers swing tennis rackets without leaving the living room. Sony's PlayStation 4 and Microsoft's Xbox One turned consoles into entertainment hubs, streaming movies, music, and lives all from a single dashboard. Yet beyond the shiny screens and booming soundtracks, something deeper pulsed through the decade: connection. Gamers forged friendships that transcended geography, falling in love, starting businesses, and even raising funds for charity, all inside virtual worlds. Fortnite emerged as the cultural juggernaut of the late 2010s, blending creativity, chaos, and community into one endlessly evolving playground. It wasn't just a game. It was a social platform disguised as fun, hosting concerts, film screenings, and cultural events inside its map. When Travis Scott performed to millions within Fortnite, the message was clear: gaming had become the new stage of the world. At the same time, The Last of Us, Red Dead Redemption 2 West, and God of War showed that gaming had mastered the language of cinema, delivering stories that rivaled Hollywood in emotion and craft. Audiences cried over digital faces, pondered moral choices, and found themselves reflecting on humanity through a controller. Games were no longer escaping reality. They were exploring it. Esports, once a curiosity, now filled arenas with fireworks and chants, while streaming platforms sold out sponsorships worth millions. Players trained like athletes, teams hired coaches, and the world finally began to understand that gaming was not a distraction. It was discipline. By 2020, the lines between gamer and creator blurred completely. Anyone could broadcast, mod, or design. The tools of development were now open to the masses, and communities thrived on creativity. Among Us, born from a small studio, became the voice of a world locked indoors, a reminder that connection could survive even isolation. The rise of the influencer era had transformed gaming from pastime to profession, from hobby to empire. Every click, every stream, every clip was content, and every player had an audience. By the close of the decade, something extraordinary had happened. Gaming wasn't just part of culture anymore, it was culture. Its sounds, its language, its heroes had seeped into music, film, fashion, and conversation. And, as the clock ticked toward a new decade, whispers began of something even more mind-bending on the horizon: metaverses, AI, virtual realities so convincing they would blur the last line between world and game. The 2010s had connected us. The 2020s, it seemed, were destined to merge us. The 2020s opened with both chaos and clarity, a time when the world outside fell silent, and the world inside screens became louder than ever. As billions sought connection, gaming rose not as an escape, but as a lifeline. Titles like Animal Crossing, New Horizons turned isolation into community, letting players visit each other's islands when airports were closed and hugs were unsafe. For many, those small digital gestures, watering a friend's flowers, sending a virtual letter, felt more human than the news outside. The pandemic didn't just change how we lived, it changed how we played. Suddenly, grandparents were playing Mario Kart, families were connecting over Jackbox games, and colleagues were building friendships inside Among Us lobbies. Gaming had become the world's meeting place, its language universal, its reach limitless. By 2021, the momentum didn't fade, it exploded. The power of consoles like the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X pushed graphics into near reality, where sweat, dust, and sunlight looked indistinguishable from life. Ray tracing painted worlds in reflections and shadows so perfect they felt tactile. But what truly defined this new age wasn't how good games looked, it was how alive they felt. Artificial intelligence began breathing personality into NPCs, and machine learning shaped dynamic worlds that adapted to every choice, every hesitation. Developers were no longer just storytellers, they were world architects. Meanwhile, cloud gaming arrived, promising the end of hardware limitations. Services like Xbox Cloud, Nvidia GeForce Now, and Google Stadia briefly hinted at a future where any device, a phone, a fridge, a TV, could summon vast digital universes in seconds. For the first time, the power of play was no longer chained to a console, it floated in the sky. Then came the whispers of the Metaverse, a word that promised infinite space, infinite connection. Companies like Meta, Epic, and countless startups began dreaming of worlds where gaming, work, and life would merge into a single continuous experience. Avatars became extensions of identity, digital property became real estate, and suddenly, play had an economy. VR headsets evolved from novelties into portals, letting players walk inside imagination itself. Yet, amid the flash of technology, a quieter shift was taking place. Games were becoming mirrors of society, tools for empathy, for education, for healing. Titles like Life is Strange, Stray, and Cyberpunk 2077 forced players to confront moral gray zones, exploring what it means to be human in an increasingly digital age. In parallel, indie creators continued to thrive, proving that one person with passion could still compete with million-dollar studios. Platforms like Steam and itch.io gave birth to cult masterpieces that pushed emotion over spectacle. Gaming was now an art form, studied in universities, debated in think tanks, and celebrated at festivals once reserved for film and literature. Meanwhile, esports reached new heights, its champions treated like rock stars. Stadiums sold out, commentators became icons, and prize pools rivaled traditional sports. Kids no longer dreamed of scoring the winning touchdown. They dreamed of lifting a digital trophy before millions watching online. Sponsorships flowed, colleges offered scholarships, and the mainstream world could no longer deny what gamers had always known. This was the future of competition. At the same time, streaming and content creation matured into legitimate careers. YouTubers and Twitch streamers evolved into brands, shaping trends, fashion, and even game design. Developers now built titles with streaming moments in mind. Cliffhangers, memes, and viral loops crafted to dominate social feeds. Gaming wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was the new media economy. And as 2025 approaches, the lines have nearly vanished. Virtual reality, augmented reality, and artificial intelligence now dance together in the same sandbox. Imagine a headset where your heartbeat drives the story, where an AI companion learns your habits, where a world changes not just because you press buttons, but because you exist within it. Imagine a future where education feels like Assassin's Creed, where therapy feels like Journey, where global summits happen inside Fortnite rather than conference halls. The future isn't science fiction anymore, it's the next patch update. The evolution of gaming has mirrored the evolution of humanity itself. From crude lines of code to living, breathing universes, it taught us that stories don't need pages, that friendship doesn't need proximity, that courage can come in pixels. From Pong's bouncing square in 1972 to the infinite metaverses of 2025, the heartbeat of gaming has never been the machines, it's been the players. You, the one holding the controller, the mouse, the phone, the VR gloves. You are the link between fantasy and reality, the architect of imagination. And as we stand on the edge of another revolution, AI-driven creativity, brain-computer interfaces, and realities we can't yet name, one thing is certain. This isn't the end of gaming's story. It's the loading screen for its next great level. So the next time someone asks why you play, smile, and tell them the truth, because inside every game lies the story of us all.